We are continuing today with The Hardy Boys, Hunting for Hidden Gold by Franklin W. Dixon. Chapter 4, A Painted Warning. The Hardys continued to look at each other, speechless. No wonder the taxi driver had seemed surprised. He must have guessed that they had escaped from Zeke and Robbie. But he had dared not risk any strong-arm tactics in full view of the neighboring houses. Probably, Frank thought, he had driven around to gain time while figuring out his next move. Maybe the driver, too, had glimpsed Robbie and was circling back to the house for help. Joe wondered, could we tackle this hood without causing an accident? I'm afraid not. As if reading his brother's mind, Frank scribbled a note on his plane ticket envelope. Hop out at first stoplight. Joe nodded tensely. 2 blocks later, a traffic signal loomed. Was just changing to yellow. The driver tried to beat the light, but an oncoming car made a left turn, blocking his way. He had to slam on the brakes. Frank nudged his brother toward the right-hand door, and Joe jerked it open.
Hey, what's the idea?
The driver snarled as the boys leapt out.
Come back!
Frank and Joe sprinted across the street. Reaching the curb, they glanced back. The driver was snarling at them, but they could not hear what he was saying. Then the light changed, and he was forced to move on in the surge of traffic. He may try a U-turn, Frank said. Let's go. Wait, here comes another taxi, Joe exclaimed. They flagged it down and jumped in. O'Hare Airport, step on it, Frank ordered. As the taxi sped off, the boys watched out the rear window, but no one was in pursuit. Whew, Joe said, giving a sigh of relief. Good thing you spotted that identification photo. Frank nodded. That thug must have stolen the car from the real driver, and not just to trap us. I'll bet it was to be used for pulling another job. Right. And that's why Hopkins told Robbie exactly where it would arrive. They may be planning a carefully timed holdup. It was only a few minutes before takeoff when the boys dashed into the air terminal. Frank made a hasty call to Captain Yaworski of the Chicago Police, an old friend. Frank quickly explained what had happened and told the chief their theory that a gang might be planning to use a stolen taxi for some crooked job. The name on the real driver's identification was Ira Cleater, Frank added. Good enough. We can get the license plate from the taxi company, and thanks for the tip. Joe, who was standing watch outside the telephone booth, rapped on the glass and pointed frantically to his wristwatch. Frank rang off, and the boys raced to the loading gate. We nearly left without you, the stewardess said as she welcomed them aboard the plane. The Hardys smiled and found seats. Soon they were airborne. The 2 boys settled back as the plane headed west. I'd sure like to know how Hopkins got word we were on our way to Lucky Lode, Frank mused. The gang out there must have informed him, Joe said. Remember, he even knows that Dad is staying with Hank Shale. Another thing, Frank went on, why should they be interested in that map? Is there some connection between Onslow's claim and the gang? We better ask Mike to send us another map. I can remember it pretty clearly, Joe assured him, then added soberly, why didn't Dad call us himself? I hope he's not hurt. Frank nodded, troubled. Lunch was served aboard the plane. Afterward, the boys dozed. At Butte, they were wary, staying close to other passengers as they changed planes. No one bothered them, however. Soon they were winging their way on a 2-motored craft over the frozen ridges of the Rockies towards Cold Springs, the small airport serving Lucky Lode. The plane set down bumpily on a snow-covered landing strip. As the Hardys came out and gazed around, a sharp, biting wind hit their faces. Whew! This is sure different, said Frank. Pine woods surrounded the bleak, windswept field with its Quonset hut terminal and hangar. A helicopter and a tiny single-engine aircraft were parked near the edge of the field. To the west loomed the snowy Bitterroot mountain range. Brrr, Joe shivered. Lonely looking, eh? Sure is, Frank replied. As the brothers headed for the terminal, a hatless man in a plaid mackinaw strode towards them.
Frank and Joe Hardy,
he boomed. He was a tall, handsome, ruddy-faced man. His white hair blew about in the wind.
I'm Bob Dodge,
he added, shaking hands with the boys heartily.
Your father's working on a case for me in Lucky Lode. I came over in my helicopter to pick you up.
Why didn't Dad come? Frank asked.
He had an accident. Broke a couple of ribs. Nothing serious, Dodge added. But the doctor taped his chest and wants him to keep quiet.
Seeing a look of suspicion on the boys' faces, Dodge took a picture from his pocket.
"Your father gave me this."
He held out a snapshot of the Hardys' house with Aunt Gertrude standing on the lawn.
"That's your father's sister," Dodge said.
Okay. Frank knew if the detective had been forced to hand over the picture, he would not have given Aunt Gertrude's true identity. Mr. Dodge must be all right. "We have to be careful," Joe explained.
"I understand," Dodge smiled. "There's some stuff in the terminal I want to pick up. You go aboard."
He gestured towards the helicopter. The boys started across the field. They were still some distance from the craft when a tall, thin man suddenly jumped out of the ship and walked rapidly away. "I wonder who he is," Joe asked. "Maybe an airport attendant?" Frank guessed. "If so, why is he headed for the woods?" Frank frowned. When they reached the helicopter, he said, "I wish I knew what that fellow was doing aboard." Joe pulled back the door and looked inside cautiously. The boys searched the helicopter, but nothing was found. Frank chuckled in relief. "Okay, we didn't get booby-trapped. Let's stow our gear." They climbed out, and Joe was about to open the access hatch to the baggage compartment just after the cabin when Frank stopped him. "Let's play safe and check this door." "Good idea." Frank took a rope from his gear and tied one end to the hatch handle. The boys backed off to one side, and Frank tugged the rope. A deafening blast rocked the craft and knocked the boys off their feet. An acrid smell of gunpowder assailed their nostrils. "Good grief!" Joe said. Pale and shaken, they examined the baggage compartment. A sawed-off shotgun had been wired and propped into position inside, evidently by someone working through a removable panel on the forward wall. The gun had been triggered by a cord tied to that hatch door. Meanwhile, the explosion had brought Bob Dodge and an older man running from the terminal. "What happened?" they yelled together. Frank explained, and the two men examined the deadly setup with dismayed looks. Joe cautioned them not to touch the weapon so it could be checked for fingerprints. Dodge's companion, who proved to be the airport manager, went off to report the incident to the police. Frank and Joe took out their fingerprint kit and dusted the shotgun. No prints appeared. "The man we saw at the copter wore gloves," Frank recalled. "But I was hoping something might show up anyhow." "The gun must have been wiped clean beforehand," Joe deduced. Soon, 2 police officers arrived. The Hardys described their near-fatal experience and reported the results of their fingerprint check. "You're detectives?" one officer asked. Frank introduced himself and his brother as Fenton Hardy's sons. "I see," said the officer. "I've heard of him. Rarely fails to solve a case. So you're following in his footsteps. Well, good luck." The brothers turned over the weapon to the policeman, who then, with the boys assisting them, made a thorough check of the helicopter. They found no clues, however, so the Hardys stowed away their gear and followed Dodge aboard the Whirlybird. "That scattergun could have been meant for me," Dodge remarked worriedly as he started the motor. "Or for us," Frank said. As the helicopter rose and soared towards the Bitterroot mountain range, Frank told Dodge of their being kidnapped in Chicago. "What is the case Dad is working on for you?" Joe asked.
"I've been running an armored car service for 10 years, the big man explained. "Recently, one of my trucks was hijacked and a money shipment stolen. Both guards aboard were shot. The money was insured, of course, but I wanted those hijackers caught to avoid any future holdup, so knowing your father's reputation for tracking down hijackers, I engaged him to investigate. My men's safety is important to me. The police have worked the case too. They and your father managed to recover the money and catch 2 of the gang, but the others escape. Someone reported seeing them in Canada."
"Then why has Dad stayed here?" Frank asked.
"Because he believes the leader of the gang, Big Al Martin, is still in the area. Your father refuses to leave until he is found."
"Well, how did Dad get hurt?" Joe questioned.
"He was thrown from a horse yesterday afternoon," Dodge replied, "while he was chasing a fellow he thinks was one of Big Al's men."
"And now, Dad wants us to try and find the outlaws?" Frank surmised.
"Yes," Dodge said, "and the sooner the better. Big Al's dangerous. He belongs behind bars. The police know he has henchmen in other cities."
As Dodge spoke, the helicopter shook, rattled in the wind. Below them, the boys saw wild, rugged country. Snow-covered buttes stood like giant sentinels overlooking heavily wooded valleys. Presently, Dodge shouted, "It won't be long now!" Ahead, in a mountain cleft, the pilot pointed out the tiny town of Lucky Lode. "Over on the left is Windy Peak, the highest in the range." "Have you been flying long, Mr. Dodge?" Joe asked. "I started taking lessons a couple of years ago, and it came easily to me." "Have you always lived in the West?" Frank added. But Dodge did not reply. "Here we go," he said, and began setting the helicopter down. Frank wondered if Dodge had not heard the question, or he did not want to discuss his past. The pilot landed expertly in a clearing at one end of Lucky Lode. Then he helped the boys lug their gear to Hank Shale's cabin at the foot of the steep hill on the outskirts of town. When Frank knocked, the door was opened by a tall, skinny man with thinning red hair. His wrinkled face split into a grin when he saw the trio. "Come in and thaw out," he exclaimed. "I'm Hank Shale, your pa, and I've been waiting for you." The boys entered to find their father seated before a roaring fire. Fenton Hardy was a trim, athletic man. His keen eyes lighted up when he saw his sons. "Hello, boys," said the detective, and moved carefully, shaking hands with them. "Thanks for giving up your camping trip." "We'd rather work with you any day," Joe said, grinning. Mr. Hardy smiled and turned to Dodge. "I appreciate you bringing your sons to me." Hank announced that he was going to the kitchen to rustle up some grub. "I'll help you," Dodge volunteered. "3 detectives can sit by the fire and exchange news." In low voices, the boys told their father all about what happened since they had left Bayport. Mr. Hardy looked grave. "I agree with you that someone must have informed Al's Chicago henchman that you were coming. But who?" He glanced towards the kitchen and called, "Hank!" When the red-haired man appeared in the doorway, Mr. Hardy asked him, "Who was in Burke's General Store when you phoned my sons last night?" "Just the usual crowd of fellers sitting around the stove," Hank replied. "I had to holler an account. There was a bad connection, so they all heard every single word." "Someone on the line might have been listening too," Joe remarked. "I smell something burning," Hank exclaimed and bolted into the kitchen. "We'll have to be on guard," said Frank. "Someone probably will be watching every move we make." "Dad," Joe asked, "what made you so sure Big Al didn't go to Canada?" "I was working with the police," Mr. Hardy said, "when we caught 2 of the gang a week before last. One of them told us Big Al was hiding out here and meant to attend to some unfinished business. The police thought he was lying in order to sidetrack us while Al made an escape. I had a hunch it was the truth." "Why?" asked Frank. "Because the man seemed scared and appeared to be hoping for a break at his trial. I started riding the hills trying to pick up Al's trail. Yesterday I followed a rough-looking fellow on horseback. He met another man in a small clearing. I heard them talking and caught the words Big Al and hideout. Just then my horse, Major, whinnied, and the men galloped off. I gave chase, but Major stumbled, and I took a spill." The detective smiled ruefully. "Now I'm stuck here, boys," he added seriously. "Your job is to find that hideout." Frank and Joe, greatly excited by the challenge, discussed it all during supper of thick western steaks, beans, and biscuits. "We'll have to get on a line on what Big Al's unfinished business is," Frank said when they were seated around the fireplace later. "In any event, it's probably illegal," his father rejoined. Presently, Dodge got up. "Guess I better get back to the hotel." "Are your offices in Lucky Lode?" Joe asked. "No, in Helena. I've been staying in town to watch some developments in the case. If there's any way I can help you boys," the big man added, "just let me know." After Dodge had left, Mr. Hardy remarked, "Bob strikes me as a fine man. Never mentions his early days, but I'm told he started his business on a shoestring and built it up by hard work." "Speaking of hard work, who wants to wash the dishes?" Laughing, the boys took Hank's hint, and before long the kitchen was shipshape. Finally, the brothers went to bed in one of 2 small rooms which led off the big one. Weary, the boys fell asleep immediately. Suddenly, they woke with a start. A rumbling noise was coming from behind the cabinet, growing louder every moment. The brothers leapt from bed. At the same instant, the cabin was jarred with a deafening crash. Frank and Joe heard Hank yell as they rushed into the living room. "Look, fire!" He pointed to the kitchen where bright yellow glow was visible. The trio dashed in. By the light of the flames, they could see that a large boulder had crashed through the back wall, overturning the stove and spewing burning firewood over the floor. The boys raced back to the bedrooms to get blankets. Spreading them over the fire, they began smothering and stamping out the flames. Mr. Hardy had hurried from his room, but the boys would not allow him to help. Meanwhile, Hank had filled a bucket at the kitchen pump and was dousing water over the hot stove. The fire sizzled angrily, but gradually died out. "Tarnation!" Hank exclaimed. "Nearest thing to an avalanche we've ever had around here." He lighted an oil lamp and everyone surveyed the damage. "What a mess," Joe grimaced. The cabin owner sighed. "A whopping big hole in the wall and some burnt flooring. Well, I reckon I can fix it tomorrow." Joe and Frank started pushing the boulder out through the hole, and then Joe gasped in surprise. On the huge stone were brightly painted letters. Rolling the boulder a bit further, the boys made out a crudely painted message. "Hardy's, leave town." "A warning from Big Al," Frank said grimly.